Welcome, beloved, to the Tending the Roots podcast, where we explore the frontier lands of new culture creation. I'm your sometimes host, Corrine Bell, and along with the co-dreamers and friends of the Rooted Global Village, we'll be in conversation, exploration, and play with changemakers, scholar activists, and teachers dedicated to culture change work and seeding futures. Hello, my brother Cliff. It's so good to have this time with you today. Thank you for taking the time to be with me.
It's so good to be here, Corinne. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you perfectly.
Okay.
Before we hit record, you were sharing a passage from Fred Moten. I don't know what work it's from, though. Would you want to share that again here? Because it was really powerful.
I would love to. It was from an interview that I read called Left of Black with Fred Moten, and it was from the John Hope Franklin Center at Duke University, where he was being interviewed. And I was reading him and listening to him in preparation for this interview today. And so the quote says, he says, "We need to renew our habits of assembly and recognize that we're part of a common project. And then that project has been given to us by our ancestors, along with the responsibility to pass that project on to our children. We have to realize that this is not just about the redemption of Black people or the liberation of Black people. It's at a stage now where the continued capacity for the earth to carry human existence and is at stake," is what he was saying. "And our tradition has something specific and important and indispensable to say about that. And all this sort of hyper-professional nastiness is something that's got to stop."
Hyper-professional nastiness. Is that referring, do you think, to this kind of aspiration towards some kind of perfectionism in everything that we're doing? Because I know that Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, in the was it Fugitive Study in Black Planning, or no, sorry, Black Planning and Fugitive Study, the Undercommons, right?
Yes,
They talk about the messiness of all that we're doing, and not just the messiness in a unintentional way, but like speculative practice, the ways that we might go about doing kind of liberatory work, but that doesn't adhere to some, very kind of rigid form, but that is in the in between. It's like in the moments of, it's walking down the street and being in dialogue. It's interacting in these kind of, I don't know. I'm at a loss for words to describe it, I think, aptly, but it evokes a kind of experimental, experimental way of being in the world and with each other.
Yes. And he was responding in that question. He was responding to an inquiry about Black pessimism, which I don't know very much about, like that tradition. And there are some people in that tradition that, because Fred Moten had once used the term Black optimism, critique of Fred and a lot of his work. And, he was actually pointing out that they have a lot in common to say, and really making the point too, that one of the things that we are called to do as we assemble is to, as one of my Taoist teachers said, when we meet, let's figure out where we can meet first.
Yes.
Before we look at each other and say, oh, here's all the places that we don't meet, but what if we start our inquiry at where can we meet?
Oh God, that's so powerful, Cliff. I mean, when we think about the way that, all of these supremacist systems have created these barriers and divisions between us, you're right. In many ways, that's our starting point. How are we divided? How have we been separated? What are the barriers between us? But to radicalize that and say, first, what do we have in common is so, it feels so radical even to say that.
Yeah.
It feels almost wrong to say that. Isn't that interesting?
Well, you know, as you and I were talking uh, before we started recording, it's countercultural. I
Yes.
mean, separability, that, you know, looking at the world through right and left and all the other, the racialized lenses, all of the lenses are like, no, you have to, as the famous word of these past few weeks, choose a side.
Yes. And then I know how
Uh,
to relate to you.
yeah. And what if, I don't know, there's something about, when I think about the way my teacher, this Taoist teacher I'm talking about, put it to me, it had to be an active inquiry. A
Mm.
lot of Taoism is about, which I studied for some years, and still practice Qigong, for example. Um, but a lot of that tradition is about what they call active interest, which is different than belief. Some people might think of it as belief. But for example, Taoism might say, oh, you have these meridians in your body. Don't believe it. Every day, engage the question, do I feel anything? Do I
Oh.
notice anything? And so every time you do your breathing practices or whatever, just notice, active interest, actively be interested. And so in a
Mm.
similar way, there was an invitation to, every time you meet a human being, to have active interest. Who are you? Who are you? And where might we meet? I think about Valerie Carr's book on that. No Strangers, I think is the title of it.
I don't know that book.
See No Strangers, I think is the title of it. I think I
Mm.
left my copy
The
to someone.
title definitely captivates.
See No
See no
Strangers.
strangers.
Mm. And that's the way she recommended too. You have to have active interest in order to do that, because there's going to be this tendency towards bias because of the way we're socialized.
Yeah.
So you have to have an active interest to see no strangers.
First of all, the fact that you've studied Taoism doesn't come as a surprise to me because I think you would be someone who I feel like reflects many of its principles. And
Mm.
Taoist philosophy has been really important in my life too. Haven't studied it maybe to the depth that you have, but even going back into high school, my first introduction into Taoism, and don't laugh, not that you would, but for the listeners, don't laugh, was through the book, The Tao of Pooh by
So good.
Benjamin Hoff.
So good.
Isn't it though? Isn't it? I actually, I haven't read it in many years, so I don't know if I would hold. I'm sure the many of the principles are still very impactful. But I remember I was maybe 16 years old the first time I read that book, and then I carried that book around with me. It was dog-eared and all marked up for many years after that. There was something so powerful in the concept of both like Wu Wei and also this notion of the uncarved block that he talked about. And I don't know the specific Taoist term for that anymore. But this, this kind of simplicity
Mhm.
that I feel is very present in that approach that you just named, the active interest. There is a simplicity that opens us up to be available to the complexity and the mystery in another being
Yes.
that I find so powerful. I mean, when I say simplicity, I mean it's like the first invitation. It's like if that's our starting point, it feels very simple as a starting point. But what it opens up to is this expansive mystery. And that is just one of the most beautiful things. When I hear you describe that, all I can tell you is that I feel like my heart grows about 10 sizes. I just feel it. I truly feel it radiating out of my chest. And that tells me that there's a deep wisdom in that.
Mm.
Because that's what I want. I think my heart wants nothing more than the ability to love you. I was just talking about this with someone else, is the ability to love you and to love you freely.
Mhm.
Everything about your identity that gets in the way of that is painful.
Yeah. Mhm. Mhm.
Do you know what I mean? Like if
Mhm.
you're a Republican, I'm Democrat,
Mhm.
you know, you hold this stance, I hold this stance, and therefore I cannot love you.
Mhm.
I've closed my heart off to you.
Mhm.
Um, rather than the leaning in and the being curious about all the things that make you who you are in this moment.
Yeah.
Is that the active
Mhm.
inquiry?
That's the stance of active inquiry. Yeah, that's totally it. My teacher would love you. He yeah, so I was probably around 15 or 16 when I there was a now this is where I'm giving away my age. There was a there was a show on television. It was both great and awful. It was great that it existed because it changed people like me. It changed our lives. It was awful that it existed for reasons that I keep discovering, and the awful reasons keep. Yeah, we'll touch on that in this conversation. Anyway, the show is called Kung Fu. And to make a long story short, it was a role, even the idea for the show came from Bruce Lee.
Oh, wow.
But at that time in the United States, um, there was no network that believed that you could have a lead character of a show that was Chinese, not even Chinese American.
Mm.
So they stole his idea and then put a white actor named David Carradine, and yeah, they basically
Yep.
did a Asian version of blackface. You know,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
it was a beautiful show though because it was exploring the traditional kung fu as studied in the Shaolin Temple in China, and that was like a heart and a thread of every single episode. And I, like a lot of black boys at that time, started studying kung fu. And when I
I
was like,
did not know that, Cliff. I studied
oh
Kung
yeah,
Fu. I didn't know you studied Kung Fu.
yeah, 14 or
Oh,
15.
yes.
You know what I didn't know? I didn't know how important kung fu and especially kung fu shows and movies were to the black, particularly black American diaspora. And it, we
Mm.
were the biggest watchers of that stuff. Did you know that? I didn't know that until recently. There's a
I,
fantastic documentary that's out about those films, and they said, you know, and our best audience was, and I was like, oh, and then they just described me for